Forced into a silent union to pay off her family's debt, Stephanie's world collides with Charles, a ruthless millionaire who sees her as nothing more than a burden. But in a twist neither expected, her quiet strength begins to unravel secrets that could change everything. Hello family, welcome to True Life Stories. Please subscribe and leave a like for us, it means the world to us. Also share this video to your friends and loved ones and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. The story begins on a gray, somber morning, as Stephanie prepares for a wedding she never wanted. The weight of her ivory gown feels suffocating, and her mother's tearful apologies echo in her mind. Despite her sorrow, Stephanie knows she has no choice. Her father's debts have left the family destitute, and this marriage is the only way to secure their survival. The wedding takes place in the grandeur of a historic hall, filled with faces she doesn't recognize. The atmosphere is heavy with judgment, as guests whisper behind fans about the mute bride who has been sold to one of the wealthiest families in the city. Stephanie keeps her gaze low, avoiding the piercing stares, while her heart pounds in her chest. At the altar, Charles stands like a statue, exuding power and authority in his tailored suit. His sharp features and cold eyes give nothing away. To him, this is just another deal, a contract to secure his own family's reputation and maintain appearances. When Stephanie finally reaches his side, there is no warmth, no connection. He doesn't even glance at her as the ceremony begins. The exchange of vows is devoid of emotion. Charles utters his "I do" as though closing a business deal. When it's Stephanie's turn, the silence in the hall grows oppressive. Unable to speak, she nods, her throat tight with unshed tears. The officiant continues, and the ceremony concludes with polite applause that feels hollow in her ears. The reception is equally detached. Charles is curt with her, spending most of the evening speaking with business associates rather than acknowledging his new wife. Stephanie sits alone at the table, feeling invisible despite the elaborate silk and pearls adorning her. When they finally arrive at Charles's sprawling mansion, Stephanie is struck by its cold magnificence. The towering walls and ornate furniture seem more like a fortress than a home. In their shared bedroom, she notices a cot arranged in the corner, far from the luxurious marital bed. The message is clear. She is not welcome in his life, even in name. As Charles retreats to his study without a word, Stephanie removes her veil and stands before the mirror. She touches the delicate lace, a bittersweet reminder of her mother's love and sacrifices. Despite her despair, she resolves to endure, knowing she must honor the price her family has paid for this union. Stephanie's standing alone by the window, gazing out at the city lights. Though her world feels small and suffocating, she holds onto a fragile hope that her silence may one day hold power of its own. The grand mansion that Charles calls home is as cold and imposing as the man himself. When Stephanie steps inside for the first time, she is struck by its vastness, long hallways, high ceilings, and rooms that seem to echo with emptiness. The mansion is filled with expensive furniture, antique paintings, and ornate chandeliers, but there is no warmth, no sign of life beyond its polished surfaces. It feels like a monument to isolation, and Stephanie is merely another piece of decoration in this carefully constructed world. Her new life, which should have been a symbol of security, quickly becomes a prison. Charles remains distant and detached, treating her presence as an inconvenience he cannot escape. Their interactions are limited to formalities, with Charles offering curt nods when he deigns to acknowledge her existence. There are no shared meals, no kind words, not even the faintest recognition of her humanity. She is nothing more than a trophy wife in his eyes, someone to display at public events and keep out of sight in private. Every morning, Stephanie finds herself alone in their vast, impersonal home. The staff, though polite, maintain their distance, speaking only when necessary and never engaging her in conversation. She understands why. Her silence makes them uneasy. Stephanie's muteness, a consequence of an accident in her childhood, only deepens the chasm between her and the world around her. Despite her ability to read and write, her inability to speak creates a wall that isolates her from others. She begins to wonder if Charles has forgotten she even exists, or if he simply doesn't care enough to remember. She spends her days wandering the mansion, trying to fill the silence with some form of distraction. She spends hours reading the few books left by Charles's late father, who had lived in this house before her. She finds solace in the stories, even as the words blur into a reflection of her own sorrow. The mansion's exterior is just as intimidating as its interior. The towering windows look out over a sprawling estate, with perfectly manicured gardens and fountains that seem to mock her lack of agency. Stephanie's only company is the occasional passing servant or housekeeper, but they avoid her gaze, unwilling to make small talk with the silent bride. As the days drag on, Stephanie becomes increasingly aware of her loneliness. The grand ballroom, where lavish events were once held, now sits silent and unused, like everything else in the house. Even the servants seem to have been trained to keep their distance from her, either out of fear or simply out of habit. She can't help but wonder if this cold, sterile environment is a reflection of Charles's own emotional state. At night, Stephanie is left to her own thoughts, lying in the cot placed in the corner of their shared bedroom. The bed, untouched by her husband, remains large and empty. Charles has made it clear from the outset that he will not sleep beside her. He is always busy with work, or at least that's what he tells her. He spends his nights in his study, lost in papers and phone calls, barely acknowledging her presence. Stephanie's thoughts are a mixture of sorrow and anger. She didn't choose this life, no one did. She had been promised a life full of hope and possibilities, but instead, she was thrust into a world that seems to be built on rules she doesn't understand. As she lies awake in the quiet of the night, her mind races. She had believed that marriage was meant to be a union of love and mutual respect, but this feels more like a silent war, where the rules have yet to be defined. Still, there's a part of Stephanie that clings to a distant hope. She knows that she must survive this life for the sake of her family, but she also wonders if there's more to her existence than simply existing in the shadows of Charles's world. With each passing day, she silently resolves to find a way to carve out her place in the mansion, no matter how small or invisible that place may be. Stephanie stands once more by the window, looking out at the moonlit grounds of the estate. The cold wind brushes against her skin, but it feels like the only comfort she's known. She whispers to herself, though no one can hear, "I will survive this." And somewhere deep within her, she knows that survival is only the beginning. Stephanie quickly learns that her silence affords her an unusual power in the mansion: invisibility. While Charles and the staff move about their lives, her quiet presence often goes unnoticed, allowing her to observe the world around her in ways others cannot. She begins to piece together the puzzle of Charles's life, uncovering layers of complexity beneath his cold exterior. Stephanie's days are largely solitary, but the rhythms of the mansion provide her with small moments of insight. She notices how the servants scurry out of Charles's way, their expressions a mix of respect and fear. His authority is absolute, his words sharp and commanding. Yet, there are fleeting moments, when he sighs heavily after a long phone call or stares out the window of his study, that suggests something deeper beneath his rigid demeanor. Her curiosity grows. Charles is an enigma to her, and while he remains emotionally distant, she cannot help but wonder what drives him. Why does he bury himself in work? What haunts him in the quiet hours of the night? These questions linger in her mind as she observes him from a distance. One afternoon, Stephanie stumbles upon his study while wandering the house. The room is unlike the rest of the mansion. Instead of cold, calculated perfection, it feels lived in, almost chaotic. Papers are scattered across the desk, books lie open on the floor, and a large cork board displays a series of charts and photos she cannot make sense of. The room smells faintly of leather and coffee, a stark contrast to the sterile halls outside. As she scans the shelves, her eyes fall on a small box tucked away in a corner. It seems out of place among the neatly arranged files and ledgers. Unable to resist her curiosity, she picks it up and carefully opens it. Inside, she finds a photograph of a younger Charles with a man she assumes is his father. They are standing in front of an old watchmaker's shop, both smiling, a stark contrast to the man she knows now. Beneath the photo is a broken pocket watch, its glass cracked and its hands frozen in place. Stephanie's fingers brush against it, and she feels a pang of emotion she doesn't fully understand. This watch, clearly treasured once, must hold some significance to Charles. She carefully places it back in the box, her mind racing with questions. That evening, she watches Charles as he sits alone in the dining room, staring blankly at a plate of untouched food. He doesn't notice her standing in the shadows, and for the first time, she sees not the commanding CEO, but a man weighed down by something she cannot name. The next day, Stephanie begins to pay closer attention to the household staff. Through their whispered conversations and hesitant glances, she gleans bits of information about Charles's past. They speak of his father, a stern but fair man who built the family's fortune from the ground up. They also mention his mother, who left the family when Charles was a boy, a betrayal that seemed to harden him forever. Stephanie starts to see patterns in Charles's behavior. His obsessive work habits, his emotional detachment, his unwillingness to let anyone close. All of it seems tied to a deep-seated fear of vulnerability. She wonders if he even realizes how much his past controls him, or if he's simply chosen to bury it beneath layers of indifference. As Stephanie continues to observe, she begins to feel an unexpected sense of empathy for Charles. She recognizes her own pain in his silence, her own isolation in his detachment. While he sees her as nothing more than a burden, she starts to see him as a man trapped by his own choices. The chapter closes with Stephanie standing outside Charles's study late at night. The light is still on, and she hears the faint sound of him pacing back and forth. For a moment, she considers knocking, offering some gesture of understanding, but she hesitates. She knows the walls between them are thick and impenetrable, for now. Instead, she retreats to her room, determined to learn more about the man who seems as trapped as she is. In the quiet of her room, Stephanie writes a single sentence in her journal. Even silence can see the truth. As the days turn into weeks, Stephanie continues to uncover pieces of Charles's hidden world, piecing together fragments of his past. Though he remains emotionally distant and largely avoids her, his actions, and the environment he inhabits, speak volumes. Stephanie's role as the mute observer allows her to see what others cannot. A man weighed down by a history that he cannot escape. One afternoon, while exploring the library, Stephanie notices an old ledger tucked into a forgotten corner. As she flips through its pages, she realizes it belonged to Charles's father, Arthur. The entries detail the early days of the family business, a struggling enterprise that grew into an empire under Arthur's relentless drive. Stephanie reads Arthur's notes, his meticulous plans, and the pride he took in building a legacy for his son. However, as the entries progress, the tone shifts. There are mentions of financial pressures, strained family relationships, and a mysterious falling out with Charles's mother, Elise. The final pages are scrawled hastily, as if written in frustration, and one entry catches her eye. Charles must carry the weight of this name, whether he likes it or not. There is no room for weakness in this family. Stephanie closes the ledger, her chest tightening with the weight of what she has learned. It's clear that Charles grew up under immense pressure, groomed from a young age to take over the family's empire. His father's expectations were not just high, they were suffocating. Later that evening, Stephanie decides to return to Charles's study. Though she hesitates to intrude, her curiosity about the photograph and pocket watch she found earlier drives her forward. The study is empty, and the broken watch still sits in its box, a silent relic of a lifelong past. Stephanie picks up the photograph again, studying the faces of the boy and man smiling in front of the watchmaker's shop. She notices the sign above the shop door, Arthur and Son Timepieces. It dawns on her that the family business wasn't always the sprawling empire it is now. It had once been a humble watchmaking shop, a place where father and son worked side by side. Her thoughts are interrupted by the sound of footsteps. She quickly replaces the items and steps away, but it's too late. Charles enters the study, his sharp gaze immediately locking onto her. "What are you doing in here?" he asks, his voice cold but laced with a hint of irritation. Stephanie hesitates, then points to the pocket watch, hoping he'll understand her silent question. Charles's eyes follow her gesture, and for a moment his expression softens. He walks over to the desk, picks up the watch, and holds it in his hands. "This was my father's," he says quietly, almost to himself. "He gave it to me when I was 10. It broke years ago, and I never bothered to fix it." Stephanie watches as his thumb traces the cracked glass, his usual stoicism giving way to a flicker of vulnerability. She senses that the watch holds more meaning than he's willing to admit. After a long pause, Charles sets the watch down and turns to her. "It's just an old relic," he says, his tone reverting to its usual coldness. "Don't waste your time." He leaves the room without another word, but Stephanie is left with a profound sense of understanding. The watch isn't just a relic, it's a symbol of a life Charles has tried to forget. Over the following days, Stephanie begins to notice other remnants of his past scattered throughout the mansion. A dusty chessboard in the corner of the library, a set of woodworking tools in the attic, a faded sketchbook tucked behind a row of books. Each item hints at a version of Charles that no longer exists, a boy with dreams and passions that were buried under the weight of his father's expectations. As Stephanie pieces together the story, she begins to see the root of Charles's coldness. His life has been defined by duty and sacrifice, leaving little room for joy or connection. While his father's legacy looms large over him, the absence of his mother has created an even deeper void. The chapter ends with Stephanie sitting by the fire in her room, the broken watch now hidden in her pocket. She turns it over in her hands, feeling the weight of its significance. For the first time, she feels a strange kinship with Charles. Though their circumstances are different, they are both bound by expectations they didn't choose. Looking out at the moonlit grounds, she silently vows to uncover more of the truth, not out of idle curiosity, but because she senses that understanding Charles's past might be the key to unlocking both their futures. The turning point in Stephanie and Charles's relationship begins not with words but with actions. Though Charles continues to avoid her, his stoic demeanor begins to crack in subtle ways, allowing moments of shared understanding to emerge. Stephanie, ever the silent observer, begins to influence his life in ways neither of them anticipate. One evening, during a particularly harsh thunderstorm, Stephanie notices Charles pacing restlessly in his study. The storm seems to agitate him, as if it stirs something buried deep within. She watches from the doorway as he stares at the broken watch on his desk, his shoulders tense. She doesn't approach, but her presence doesn't go unnoticed. "I can't concentrate with you standing there," he mutters, though there's no real malice in his tone. Stephanie steps forward cautiously, her bare feet soft on the wooden floor. She picks up the broken watch and gestures as if asking for permission to take it. Charles looks at her, surprised, but nods. "It's not worth fixing," he says quietly. "It's too far gone." Stephanie shakes her head gently, as if to disagree, and leaves the room with the watch in hand. The next day, she visits the mansion's workshop, a space she discovered during her solitary wanderings. Though it hasn't been used in years, the tools remain sharp, and the space is well lit by a large window. Stephanie spends hours carefully repairing the watch, her hands steady as she replaces the cracked glass and adjusts the delicate inner mechanisms. When she returns the watch to Charles, he stares at it in disbelief. The cracks are gone, and the hands tick steadily, as if time itself has been restored. He doesn't say thank you, but the way he holds the watch, reverent, almost tender, speaks volumes. "I didn't think you could fix it," he says finally, his voice softer than she's ever heard it. Stephanie doesn't reply, but her small smile conveys everything she wants to say. This act of kindness becomes a catalyst for change. Over the following weeks, Charles begins to notice Stephanie in a way he never did before. Her quiet resilience, her attentiveness, and her ability to see beyond his walls begin to chip away at his defenses. One morning, Stephanie notices that Charles has left a note on the dining table. It's not much, a brief mention of a business trip and the time he'll return. But it's the first time he's made an effort to communicate with her directly. She writes a reply on the same note, thanking him for letting her know, and leaves it where he'll see it. This exchange becomes a habit. Though they don't speak, they begin to leave notes for each other, sharing small details about their days. The notes grow longer over time, revealing glimpses of their personalities. Stephanie writes about the books she's been reading and the places she's explored in the mansion, while Charles occasionally shares anecdotes about his work and the challenges he faces. Their interactions also extend beyond written words. Stephanie starts to prepare tea for Charles in the evenings, leaving it on his desk while he works late into the night. At first, he barely acknowledges the gesture, but one evening, he thanks her quietly as she turns to leave. "You don't have to do this," he says, his voice hesitant. Stephanie stops and looks at him, her expression calm but resolute. She shakes her head, as if to say, "I want to." These small, unspoken exchanges begin to build a fragile bond between them. Charles starts to soften in her presence, and though he remains guarded, there are moments when his vulnerability shines through. He asks her questions about her past, her family, and her interests. While her answers are limited to gestures and written notes, he listens intently, showing a side of himself she never expected. One evening, as they sit together in the library, Charles surprises Stephanie by asking her to play a game of chess. Though she's initially hesitant, she nods, and they set up the board. The game is slow and quiet, but it's the first time they've shared an activity together. When Stephanie wins, Charles raises an eyebrow, a small smirk playing at the corner of his lips. "Didn't expect that," he admits. "You're full of surprises." The chapter closes with Charles returning the favor. He gifts Stephanie a beautiful sketchbook, recognizing her love of drawing from the notes she's left him. Though he says little as he hands it to her, the gesture speaks volumes. As Stephanie runs her fingers over the leather cover, she feels the weight of what's beginning to blossom between them. An unspoken bond built not on words, but on understanding and mutual respect. For the first time, she senses that Charles sees her not as an obligation, but as someone who matters. The tentative bond between Stephanie and Charles faces its first true test as secrets from his past, and her place in his life, begin to come to light. The chapter begins with a rare evening where Charles invites Stephanie to accompany him to a formal gala hosted by a prominent business partner. At the event, Stephanie notices how the world outside the mansion perceives Charles. He is the consummate businessman, charming, confident, and commanding. Yet, as the night progresses, she begins to see cracks in this polished facade. Whispers among the guests reveal rumors about the fragility of his family's empire and the hidden power struggles threatening his carefully constructed world. During a moment of quiet amidst the crowded room, Stephanie observes a tense exchange between Charles and a man she overhears being called Victor. Victor, a rival businessman with a predatory air, speaks with an unsettling familiarity. His words are laced with veiled threats and hints at an unresolved conflict. "It's only a matter of time before you falter, Charles," Victor says, his voice low but firm. "And when you do, I'll be there to pick up the pieces." Charles's jaw tightens, but he doesn't respond, instead excusing himself and pulling Stephanie away. She notices the way his hand trembles slightly as it rests on her arm. When they return home, the tension doesn't dissipate. Charles retreats to his study, and Stephanie feels the weight of unanswered questions pressing down on her. Her silent world, once a shield, now feels like a barrier to uncovering the truth. The next day, Stephanie stumbles upon a new discovery while exploring the attic. Hidden behind a stack of dusty crates is an old chest. Inside, she finds a collection of letters, photographs, and legal documents. The letters are from Charles's mother, Elise, written to him after she left the family. Through the letters, Stephanie pieces together the story of Elise's departure. She learns that Elise had been stifled by the same expectations Charles now shoulders. Desperate to escape a loveless marriage and reclaim her freedom, Elise left, leaving Charles to face his father's wrath alone. Her letters are filled with guilt and longing, but they were never sent. Each one is marked, "Return to sender." Among the papers, Stephanie also finds a stack of financial documents that reveal troubling details about the family business. Though the company appears prosperous, it's clear that Charles is fighting to keep it afloat. Risky investments, mounting debts, and pressure from rivals like Victor paint a picture of a man trying to hold together a crumbling empire. Determined to help in any way she can, Stephanie confronts Charles that evening. She places one of Elise's letters on his desk and points to it, her eyes questioning. Charles freezes when he sees the letter, his face unreadable. "Where did you find this?" he asks, his voice low and controlled. Stephanie gestures to the attic, then sits down, waiting for him to explain. For a long moment, Charles doesn't speak. Then, with a heavy sigh, he begins to share the truth. He tells her about his mother's departure, the anger and abandonment he felt, and the years of resentment that followed. He explains how his father, Arthur, demanded perfection from him, molding him into a successor who could never falter. "I hated her for leaving," he admits, his voice strained. "But I hated him more for making me believe I couldn't survive without her." Charles also reveals the current state of the family business. Victor's threats aren't idle. He's been working behind the scenes to destabilize the company, leveraging their financial struggles to force a hostile takeover. "It's all falling apart," Charles says, his voice heavy with defeat. "I've spent my entire life trying to prove I could hold this together, but maybe I was wrong." Stephanie listens intently, her heart aching for the man in front of her. Though she cannot speak, she places her hand over his, offering silent reassurance. She writes him a single note. "You're not alone in this anymore." This moment marks a shift in their relationship. Charles, who has spent his life pushing people away, begins to rely on Stephanie in ways he never expected. He allows her into his world, sharing his fears and frustrations as they work together to confront the challenges ahead. Stephanie also takes on a more active role, using her keen observation skills to uncover patterns in Victor's schemes. She begins to assist Charles with his work, organizing his files and pointing out inconsistencies he may have overlooked. Though she cannot speak, her actions communicate volumes, and Charles comes to value her input deeply. A confrontation occurred between Charles and Victor at a high-stakes board meeting. Stephanie attends, sitting quietly at Charles's side, her presence a source of strength for him. As Victor attempts to undermine Charles's authority, Charles counters with newfound confidence, bolstered by Stephanie's quiet support. In the aftermath, Charles realizes just how much Stephanie has become a part of his life. Her resilience, kindness, and unwavering presence have shown him that strength doesn't always come from words. It can come from silence, too. For the first time in years, Charles begins to believe that he might not have to face the future alone. The growing partnership between Stephanie and Charles begins to evolve into something deeper as they face mounting challenges together. What started as a reluctant union has slowly transformed into a bond built on mutual respect and trust. For the first time, Stephanie feels seen and valued, and Charles finds solace in her unwavering presence. Victor's schemes intensify, threatening to dismantle Charles's company and tarnish his family's reputation. Late nights in the study become a regular occurrence, with Stephanie by Charles's side, silently supporting him as he reviews documents and plans countermeasures. Though she cannot speak, her quiet strength provides him with clarity during moments of doubt. One evening, as Charles struggles to focus on a particularly complicated financial strategy, Stephanie brings him a cup of tea and places a notebook in front of him. Inside, she has written down observations she's made about Victor's patterns, subtle connections and inconsistencies that Charles had missed. He stares at the notes, then at her, his expression a mix of surprise and gratitude. "You see things I don't," he says softly. "I would have missed this entirely." Stephanie simply nods, her lips curving into a small, reassuring smile. Their collaboration pays off when Charles uncovers a crucial piece of evidence that exposes Victor's underhanded tactics. Armed with this information, Charles secures a major victory during a critical board meeting, saving the company from immediate danger. The stress of the battle against Victor takes its toll on Charles, and Stephanie begins to see a side of him that he rarely reveals. One night, after a particularly grueling day, she finds him in the library, staring at the fireplace with a glass of whiskey in his hand. "I've spent my whole life fighting to keep this legacy alive," he says quietly, his voice tinged with exhaustion. "Sometimes I wonder if it's even worth it." Stephanie sits down beside him, her presence comforting in the silence. She picks up her notebook and writes a single line. "It's worth it if it means something to you." Charles reads the note and sighs, rubbing a hand over his face. "It does," he admits. "But I don't know who I'm doing this for anymore. My father? The people who depend on me? Myself?" Stephanie places her hand on his, her touch grounding him. She writes again. "You don't have to do it alone." For a moment, Charles looks at her, and something shifts in his expression. The barriers he's carefully built over the years begin to crumble, and he allows himself to lean into her presence. As their connection deepens, Charles starts to show his affection in small but significant ways. He begins to seek out Stephanie's company, inviting her to share meals or join him during quiet moments in the garden. Though their conversations remain limited to written notes and gestures, the understanding between them grows stronger. One day, Stephanie is surprised to find a small package waiting for her on her bedside table. Inside is a set of artist's supplies, pencils, paints, and a high-quality sketchbook. There's also a note in Charles's handwriting, for when words aren't enough. Stephanie's heart swells at the gesture. She begins to use the supplies to express herself in ways she never could before, creating vivid drawings and paintings that capture her emotions and the beauty she sees in the world around her. One evening, she leaves a drawing on Charles's desk, a delicate sketch of the repaired pocket watch, surrounded by blooming flowers. When Charles finds it, he's momentarily speechless. He frames the drawing and hangs it in his study, a silent testament to their growing connection. As they grow closer, Stephanie encourages Charles to confront the ghosts of his past. She leaves Elise's letters on his desk, carefully arranged so he cannot ignore them. Though reluctant at first, Charles finally reads them, allowing himself to feel the pain and betrayal he has buried for so long. One night, he confides in Stephanie about his mother. "I spent years hating her for leaving," he says, his voice heavy with emotion. "But now I think I understand why she did. She wanted freedom. something I've never allowed myself to have. Stephanie writes him a note. Maybe it's time you did. Her words resonate with Charles, and he begins to take steps toward letting go of the burdens he has carried for so long. He starts delegating more responsibilities within the company, freeing himself to focus on what truly matters. The chapter reaches its climax during a tense family event. Victor, still bitter from his recent defeat, makes a public scene, accusing Charles of being weak and incapable of leading. The confrontation escalates, and for a moment, it seems as though Victor might succeed in undermining Charles's authority. But then Stephanie steps forward. Though she cannot speak, her calm and steady presence commands attention. She hands Charles a note she has written in advance, urging him to read it aloud. Charles hesitates, then looks down at the note. His voice is steady as he reads. Strength isn't about doing everything alone. It's about knowing when to lean on those who care for you. Together, we are stronger than you could ever imagine. The room falls silent, and Victor retreats, his confidence shaken. Stephanie's quiet courage has not only bolstered Charles, but also demonstrated the power of their partnership to everyone present. Charles and Stephanie share a quiet moment in the garden, the moonlight casting a soft glow around them. For the first time, Charles allows himself to truly look at Stephanie, not as a mute bride or an obligation, but as the woman who has changed his life. Thank you, he says, his voice filled with emotion. Stephanie doesn't need to respond with words. She simply places her hand over his, and in that moment, they both understand that their bond has grown into something neither of them expected. Love without words, built on trust, respect, and unwavering support. Finally, the story marks the culmination of Stephanie and Charles's journey as individuals and as a couple. Through their shared struggles and triumphs, they redefine their marriage, transforming it from a forced arrangement into a union rooted in love, trust, and mutual growth. With Victor defeated and the company's future secured, Charles and Stephanie finally find themselves with room to breathe. The chaos of the past few months has given way to a calm, reflective period. Charles begins to reevaluate his priorities, realizing how much of his life he has spent chasing his father's approval and fighting battles that no longer matter. One morning, as they sit together in the garden, Charles turns to Stephanie. I've been thinking, he says, his voice steady but thoughtful. For so long, I've been running this company the way my father wanted. But maybe it's time to do things differently. Maybe it's time to build something that reflects who I am now, who we are. Stephanie smiles at his words, sensing the weight of the decision. She writes a note in her notebook and hands it to him. The future is ours to create. Charles begins to take steps to break free from the shadow of his father's legacy. He implements changes in the company, focusing on ethical practices and sustainable growth rather than cutthroat business strategies. His decisions are met with resistance from some, but Stephanie's unwavering support gives him the strength to stand by his convictions. Meanwhile, Stephanie starts to find her own voice in their shared world, not through speech, but through her art. Encouraged by Charles, she begins to showcase her drawings and paintings, turning the once empty walls of the mansion into a gallery of her creations. Her art reflects their journey, capturing moments of pain, hope, and transformation. The staff, who once treated her with quiet pity, now regard her with admiration. They see the changes she has inspired in Charles and the warmth she has brought to the mansion. Slowly but surely, Stephanie becomes not just Charles's wife, but an integral part of the household and the business. One evening, as they share dinner together, Charles surprises Stephanie with a small gift, a delicate gold bracelet adorned with a charm in the shape of a quill. It's for you, he says, his voice uncharacteristically shy. To remind you of the way you've taught me to see things differently, and how you've given me the strength to write a new story for myself. Stephanie's eyes fill with tears as she accepts the gift, her gratitude shining through her silent smile. She writes him a note. We wrote this story together. From that moment on, their relationship takes on a new dynamic. They become true partners, supporting each other's dreams and aspirations. Charles begins to open up. More, sharing his thoughts and fears without hesitation. Stephanie, in turn, becomes more confident, her silence no longer a barrier, but a strength that defines her unique perspective on the world. A sudden crisis that threatens to undo all they have worked for occurred. A fire breaks out at one of the company's factories, endangering workers and risking public backlash. Charles and Stephanie face the challenge together, rallying the staff and community to provide support and rebuild. During the chaos, Stephanie steps into a leadership role for the first time, organizing relief efforts and ensuring that the workers are cared for. Though she cannot speak, her actions communicate her strength and compassion, earning her the respect and admiration of everyone involved. Charles watches her in awe, realizing just how much she has grown, and how much he has come to rely on her. In that moment, he sees Stephanie not as a mute bride or a symbol of his past mistakes, but as the heart of his future. When the crisis is resolved, Stephanie and Charles return home, exhausted but triumphant. As they sit together in the quiet of the study, Charles takes Stephanie's hand. "I never thought I'd say this," he begins, his voice filled with emotion, "but marrying you, no matter how it started, was the best decision I ever made." Stephanie smiles and writes her reply. "And I would do it all again for this." The mansion, once a cold and lifeless place, now feels like a home. The walls echo with laughter and warmth, the staff move with newfound confidence, and the rooms are filled with light and life. Stephanie and Charles have created a space where they both belong, a testament to the love and partnership they have built together. The story ends with Stephanie and Charles walking hand in hand through the garden, the sun setting behind them. Stephanie stops to sketch the scene in her notebook, capturing the beauty of the moment. Charles watches her with a quiet smile, marveling at how far they've come. "You've taught me something I never thought I'd understand," he says. Stephanie looks at him, her expression curious. "That love doesn't need words," he continues. "It just needs two people willing to build it together." Stephanie places her hand over his, her silent agreement clear. Together, they look out over the horizon, ready to face whatever the future holds, knowing that their bond will carry them through anything. The story concludes with the words Stephanie writes in her journal that evening. "Love is not about what we say, it's about what we do and who we become together." Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the story. Turn on your notification for my next video.